Forget everything you think you know about medieval battles, because they didn't start with a trumpet blast. They started with vomiting, with trembling hands, gripping crude weapons, with men whispering prayers, not out of piety, but panic. This wasn't a chessboard of noble knights and heroic charges. This was chaos, soaked in blood, screamed in mud. You want to know what really happened when swords clashed and shields shattered? It wasn't honor, it wasn't glory. It was survival, raw, violent, and terrifying. From the first swing to the last breath, medieval combat wasn't just about fighting your enemy, it was about fighting your instincts, your fear, your body trying to flee. What unfolded on those battlefields wasn't strategy. It was desperation, brutality, and sometimes the miracle of still being alive when it was over. 1. The battle was pure chaos. No clear signals, heroic charges, or elegant combat moves. Most soldiers couldn't even hear the horn to begin the attack. The battlefield was muddy, disorganized, and filled with panic. Many soldiers tripped or vomited in the opening seconds. Fighting was more like a violent rugby scrum than choreographed duels. Screaming was mostly involuntary terror relief. What if everything you thought you knew about medieval warfare was wrong? Not just the swords and shining armor, but the entire image, the gallant knights, the poetic clashes, the honor-driven duels. Because in truth, a medieval battle didn't begin with trumpet blasts or heroic charges. It began with something much simpler, much quieter, and much more terrifying. A deep, nauseating thud, the kind your stomach makes just before you vomit, the kind that tells your body it's about to be torn from its comfort zone and thrown into chaos. Real medieval battlefields weren't scenes of honor. They were muddy, smelly, blood-drenched fields of confusion, where even veterans often couldn't tell which way was forward, and many soldiers soiled themselves before taking their first step. And why wouldn't they? Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder in the damp morning mist, flanked by the stench of old sweat, leather, fear, and food eaten too fast. The kind that churns in your gut like a cauldron. Your hands shake, your mouth is dry. Somewhere ahead of you is a group of equally terrified men, also holding spears, also wondering if they'll survive the next hour. There's no grand strategy anymore, no map, just the hope that if you run when everyone else runs, swing when everyone else swings, and scream louder than your fear, you might, just might, make it out alive. This wasn't battle. This was bedlam. A fight in a tavern dragged out across an entire field. The reality is that medieval armies rarely started in clean lines. Even when formations were planned, tight phalanxes, clever wedge assaults, flanking maneuvers, they often collapsed seconds into contact. One misstep, one unexpected charge, one panicked scream from the rear lines, and formation dissolved into a frenzy of grunts and gore. Most men couldn't even hear their commanders, let alone follow orders. The noise was deafening, horns blaring, drums pounding, men shouting commands and prayers and curses in equal measure. And through it all, the unmistakable hum of thousands of hearts beating, not with courage, but with the kind of fear that makes you want to turn and sprint. That's why so many battles were won before a sword was even drawn. The army that managed to keep its footing, both physically and psychologically, often had the upper hand. Because once the two sides collided, it wasn't war, it was a dogpile, and it didn't look like the movies. No space for elegant swings, no duels. Just raw, panicked shoving, stabbing, clubbing. Often at point-blank range, with weapons. You could barely raise. Some men vomited, others wept. Some screamed so hard they passed out. That's how battles often began. With a sickening thud, as flesh hit steel, bodies hit mud, and men realized they were no longer men in an army. They were meat in a grinder. And if you fell, if you slipped just once, odds are you weren't getting back up. 2. Staying alive meant staying upright. Falling was often fatal. You'd be trampled or stabbed. The ground became slick with blood and waste. Soldiers had minimal space to swing weapons. Most strikes were jabs or awkward half-swings. Most deadly blows came from downward crushes to the skull or neck when someone fell. If you want to understand what really happened in a medieval battle, don't look at who swung harder, look at who stayed standing. Because in the crush of bodies and blind chaos, your deadliest enemy wasn't always the sword, it was gravity. And losing your footing often meant losing your life. That's the horrifying truth most reenactments in Hollywood scenes leave out. The moment your knees buckled or you tripped on a corpse or slick blood-slick mud, you didn't just fall, you vanished, trampled, crushed, forgotten. The men behind you couldn't stop. The men in front didn't care, and the ones beside you, they were too busy trying not to join you. Because the battle didn't pause when you went down, it flowed over you like a wave. Imagine this, you're shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, shields locked, breathing fast. You swing your mace. Maybe you land a hit, maybe you don't. You try to step back, but your heel catches something soft, a foot, a hand, a body. You stumble, you drop, and the moment you hit the earth, it's not a fair fight anymore. It's panic. You twist, trying to get up, but your armor weighs down your chest. Mud fills your mouth. Something lands on your back, a boot, maybe a knee. Then a spike, a blade, a hoof, a shield. Your scream is drowned in the thunder of 100 feet and the roar of war. And just like that, you're gone. Not from the world, but from the story. Because no one's writing down the names of the men who slipped. This is why soldiers fought so desperately to stay upright. Balance wasn't just helpful, it was everything. Even the most well-trained warrior became helpless the second he went down. It didn't matter how sharp your blade was, or how shiny your armor gleamed in the morning sun, if your back touched the dirt. Odds were good, it was the last thing you'd ever feel. And the worst part, the ground itself turned against you. The battlefield was a swamp of rot and gore and terror. Blood mixed with churned earth. The shit of terrified men soaked into the mud. Horses fell and thrashed. Corpses piled. The field became slick, uneven, treacherous. You could fall on a patch of broken bone or twist your ankle on a discarded shield. And once down, it didn't take much. A stray swing, a wild boot, a blow to the head you didn't see coming. Some men were crushed by the weight of their own. Sides charge. Imagine being killed not by your enemy's blade, but by your friend's boot stepping on your neck as he ran. Staying on your feet was so crucial that some veterans fought with shorter weapons, not for reach, but for control. A long sword might look impressive, but a short blade gave you stability in the tight scrum. You could stab in close quarters, without overbalancing. And more importantly, you could anchor yourself, because you never, ever wanted to go down. 3. Weapons were brutal and crude. Swords were rare, expensive, and often broke. Spears were the most common due to reach and low cost. Maces and axes were designed to crush, not slice. Peasants often used modified farming tools. Many weapons were poorly made, rusted, or unbalanced, not the polished gear we see in museums. You've seen the sword fights clean, balletic movements, blades whistling through the air like an elegant conversation. But on a real medieval battlefield, weapons didn't sing. They screamed, they clanged, they crunched, they broke, and most of all, they were ugly. The myth of the perfectly balanced longsword, shimmering in the sun as it slashes through armor with grace, is just that, a myth. Most medieval weapons were crude, heavy, and brutal, designed not to dazzle but to damage. The most common weapon, not a knight's sword, but a farmer's spear, a sharpened stick with a metal tip. It was cheap, effective, and easy to thrust forward in a crowd, because, let's be clear, you didn't have space to swing a sword in the crush of a melee. You had room for stabbing, jabbing, and occasionally smashing if you were lucky enough to keep your feet planted, and swords. Expensive, rare. You didn't issue swords to the peasantry. You gave them polearms, axes, clubs, things that could be made in a forge or a barn. And even the swords that did show up weren't the pristine, perfectly honed instruments we imagine. They were chipped, notched, and often poorly made. Soldiers reused weapons found on the dead. They carried rusty blades or mismatched parts. Nothing about this was elegant. It was desperation dressed in steel. The real workhorses of medieval battle were maces and axes. Maces weren't designed to slice. They were built to crush. A swing from a mace didn't carve a wound, it shattered ribs, splintered skulls, and turned soft tissue into jelly beneath armor. And if you were unlucky enough to take one to the head, even with a helmet, the impact alone could knock you unconscious, or worse. Axes, they were the brute cousin of the sword. Cheap to make, easy to handle, and devastating when buried. In bone, a single hack could cleave a shoulder or embed in a thigh. Pulling it out, not easy. Sometimes, the axe stayed in the victim while the attacker reached for a backup. And yes, there were bows, but not the graceful long-distance killers we think of in fantasy stories. Bows were effective, especially in disciplined units like the English longbowmen. But most of the time, the real killing happened face to face. And face to face is where things got personal. Bloody, awkward. You didn't duel, you bashed, you shoved. You hit people with the pommel of your weapon, you punched, you screamed. Sometimes you bit. One contemporary account even described a knight beating another to death with a cooking pan. Not because he ran out of weapons, but because it was the only thing in reach. This wasn't about honor, it was about survival. You used what you had, and when it broke, and it often did, you grabbed the next thing or fought with fists. Museum pieces show beautiful weapons, polished and pristine. But those are the survivors, ceremonial, decorative, rarely swung in real anger. The real weapons. They were bent, splattered, dull-edged from hacking through wood and bone. They told stories, not of glory, but of grit. For mental breakdown was common. Soldiers quickly lost direction, mistook allies for enemies, and often couldn't tell if they were bleeding. Battle mind took over muscle memory, replaced thought. Time became distorted. Movement dictated survival. Many survivors reported emotional detachment and memory loss during combat. If you think a medieval battle broke bones, you're right. But what it broke faster was minds. We talk about armor, weapons, strategy, but what no one tells you is how quickly the human brain short-circuits under that kind of stress. What really happened in a medieval battle wasn't just physical, it was psychological disintegration. Because after the first clash, The noise didn't just come from outside, it came from inside. Your brain starts to break things apart. Sounds stretch, time warps. You swing your blade. Did you hit something? You can't tell. Your vision narrows. Your hands are numb. You don't feel the cut on your leg. You don't feel anything. That's the body's way of protecting you. It floods your system with adrenaline and cortisol. Fight or flight, that ancient system kicks in like a switch. But there's nowhere to fly, and the fight. It's not clean, it's not planned. It's just chaos. So your brain turns to something else, instinct. That's why trained soldiers fought better, not because they were braver, but because their instincts had been drilled to do the right thing. Everyone else, they panicked, or froze, or lost all sense of direction. Many soldiers in medieval battles couldn't tell which way they were facing. They stabbed shadows, they struck allies, they forgot why they were even there. Some even stood still and were cut down without swinging once. Because when the world explodes into a swirl of steel, screaming, and blood, thinking is a luxury your brain can't afford. That state, what we'd now call a combat trance, was common. Survivors describe not remembering anything after the initial clash. Hours passed like seconds, or seconds like hours. You don't count kills, you don't track wounds, you just move, block, stab, duck, breathe, repeat, until something changes, the sound fades, the line breaks, or you fall. And even if you survive, the battle doesn't leave you. Not really. That 1,000-yard stare, it was born here. That silence around the fire afterward, as men stared into their hands or into the void, that was real, because trauma didn't begin with modern war. It just didn't have a name yet. They didn't call it PTSD. They just said a man was changed after battle. Quiet, hollow, strange. They didn't know what was happening, but we do. Their brains rewired. Their sense of safety broke. Some never recovered. And that's the cost we rarely measure. The cost paid in sleepless nights, in flinches when a pot falls, in the inability to ever walk through a quiet forest without expecting an ambush. The battle didn't end when the swords stopped swinging. For many, it never ended at all. 5. Armor helped, but not much. Armor could absorb some hits, but also turned into a slow death trap due to heat exhaustion or blunt force trauma. Chainmail and helmets protected in theory, but often failed in practice, especially under crushing or stabbing blows. The gleaming knight in full plate armor, invincibly, impenetrably, invulnerably. That's the myth, but the truth. Armor helped, yes, but not always in the way you'd think. In the heat of medieval battle, it could protect you, or it could slowly turn into your coffin. Let's strip it down. Chainmail wasn't light. Full hauberk, that's the long shirt of interlinked metal rings, could weigh 20 to 30 pounds. It offered solid protection against slashes, yes, but blunt force trauma, that still hit like a cart. A mace didn't need to pierce armor, it just needed to hit hard enough to break your ribs beneath it. And that's exactly what happened. The kinetic energy didn't stop at the chain. It echoed through your bones. Now, add a helmet, maybe a great helm, full-faced, iron-plated, barely any visibility. You couldn't hear well. You couldn't see well. You could barely breathe after half an hour under the sun. Then came plate armor, better in many ways, but heavier, bulkier. Yes, it could deflect a blade. Yes, it could save you from an arrow. But when you're in the middle of a panicked scrum, pressed on all sides, gasping for air and slick with sweat. That armor turns into a heat trap. You overheat, fast. Men collapsed not from wounds but from exhaustion. Heat stroke was a quiet killer on medieval fields. Soldiers would simply stagger, fall, and never get up. Their body boiled inside a steel cage. And good luck getting back up if you fell in full plate. There's a reason squires stayed nearby, not just to hand weapons, but to haul their knight upright again. You fall in that shell, and you're helpless. Even worse, if the terrain is muddy, then you're not just vulnerable, you're sinking. Some men drowned in their own armor, face down in puddles, unable to roll over. There's also the smell. We never talk about the smell. Men sweated through their gambesons, the padded layers beneath the metal for days. The stench of iron, rot, mold, and human panic soaked into every seam. And if you were wounded, removing armor was hell. Battlefield medics, if they existed at all, had to unlace, unbuckle, and unpeel layers just to reach a wound. By the time they did, you might already be halfway to death. And then there was the psychological effect. Wearing armor gave some men a false sense of invulnerability. They charged harder, fought riskier, stayed in the melee too long. But all it took was one lucky swing, one arrow through the eye slit, one dagger in the armpit gap, and it was over. Armor didn't make you a god. It just bought you a few extra moments, sometimes enough to survive, sometimes just enough to die last. The truth is, armor was a tool. It gave you a chance, not a guarantee, and every man wearing it knew that. They felt it in the way their lungs heaved, in the way their backs ached, in the way their legs quivered after an hour of standing. Still, holding the line, praying the guy in front fell before they did. 6. Cowardice was survival. Around 40% of soldiers fled before battles peaked. The tavern is full of runners. The graveyard is full of heroes. Faking death, hiding, or even crawling inside a dead horse were valid survival strategies. We love the stories of those who stood and fought, who held the line, who died with swords in their hands and defiance in their eyes. But let's talk about the other ones, the ones who ran, the ones who saw the chaos, smelled the blood, felt the tremble in their knees, and bolted, not because they were cowards, but because they wanted to live. In medieval battles, running wasn't just common, it was expected. Even seasoned commanders understood that, when the tide turned, survival often meant turning your back on the battlefield. Sometimes a single shout could cause a rout. One group panics, and suddenly the whole line dissolves. Morale didn't trickle, it collapsed like a dam breaking. And when it did, the bravest thing you could do wasn't hold the line. It was get the hell out of there before you got trampled. The taverns were full of runners, the graveyards full of heroes, and the math didn't lie. About 40% of casualties in medieval battles occurred after the losing side began to flee. That's when the killing truly began. Why? Because a fleeing man is easier to kill. His back is turned, his shield is gone. His focus is escape, not defense. So the victorious side, fueled by adrenaline, rage, or revenge, pursued with ruthless efficiency. The slaughter didn't stop at the field's edge. It chased them down ravines, across rivers, into forests. And yet, even knowing that, men still ran because the moment you knew your side was collapsing, staying felt like suicide. So you ran, some faked death, dropping to the ground and holding their breath beneath the bodies of others. Some crawled beneath carts or shield walls, waiting for the noise to end. Some even rolled themselves into ditches or curled inside dead horses. These weren't dishonorable moves. They were intelligent. They were survival, because honor didn't feed your family. It didn't mend your bones, and it certainly didn't resurrect you. Some of these runners lived to fight another day, and not just fight, but lead. Medieval records are filled with names of men who fled one battle only to become heroes in another. One knight, known for abandoning the field during a disastrous French campaign, later returned to command an entire flank in a decisive victory, because surviving a battle, especially one where everything went wrong, taught you more than dying in a glorious last stand ever could. And sometimes retreat wasn't chaos. Sometimes it was coordinated, tactical, intentional. A feigned retreat was a strategy used by Mongols, Normans, and others to draw enemies into traps. So running wasn't always fear. It could be calculated. It could be rehearsed. It could even be part of the plan. But whether it was planned or pure panic, one thing was certain. It didn't make you weak. It made you human. And in a world where steel sang and ground screamed, humanity was hard to hold on to. 7. Medical care was primitive. No sterilization, few trained medics, and most battlefield care came from fellow soldiers. Amputations were common, often done just to be quick. Mortality from infection was higher than from wounds. If you think the worst part of a medieval battle was the fight itself, think again. Because if you were lucky enough to survive the charge, the crush, the chaos, you now had to survive what came after. And what came after was worse. Welcome to medieval battlefield medicine, where bleeding out was the rule, not the exception. And help was less healing hands, and more hold him down and pray he doesn't scream too much. Let's start with the basics. There were no sterile tools, no antibiotics, no understanding of infection, no concept of germs. Wounds were stitched with dirty needles. Swords used to kill were sometimes reused to cauterize. Boiling oil might be poured on a cut, not to hurt you, but to seal the wound. And yes, that's exactly as horrifying as it sounds. You could survive a blade to the arm, but the fever that followed, that was often the real killer. In fact, a simple scratch, if deep enough and left untreated, could turn fatal within days. Battlefield triage, it barely existed. If you were nobility, maybe you had a squire or a surgeon with you. If you were a peasant, you had your friends, your belt, and your luck. Some men dragged themselves to safety using broken spears as crutches. Others lay for hours, or even days, moaning beneath piles of bodies, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice they were still alive. And if they did, well, that's when the real pain began. Amputations were common, not because they were the best option, but because they were the only option. Gangrene, that blackening death creeping up a limb, meant the arm or leg had to go. Quickly, no anesthesia, no numbing, just a strong grip, a saw, and a man who could cut fast and hold his stomach. Sometimes they used alcohol to dull the pain. Not for the patient, but for the surgeon. And even then, the odds were bleak. The body didn't need much encouragement to give up. Shock, blood, loss, infection. They all came for you in the hours after the fighting stopped. And yet, some did survive. Their wounds became their stories. A missing eye meant you had seen war and walked away. A scarred face, that was a badge. It said, I've been to the edge and made it back. But the cost was immense, and not all scars were visible. Many survivors carried their trauma quietly. They flinched at loud noises. They wept in their sleep. They limped through the rest of their lives, not just physically, but emotionally, dragging invisible weight through every step. So yes, surviving the battlefield was hard, but surviving the days after, that was often even harder, because the fighting might have stopped, but your body didn't know that. It kept bleeding, it kept shaking, and sometimes it simply didn't stop. 8. Victory meant you weren't dead yet. No flags, cheers, or triumphant speeches. Just the realization you were still breathing. After battle, soldiers scavenged armor, got drunk for days, and tried to forget the trauma. You might imagine. That victory in a medieval battle meant celebration, banners raised high, triumphant roars, knights shining in golden sunlight. But that image, it's fiction. Because when the dust settled, the blood congealed, and the screaming finally faded, most men didn't feel like winners. They just felt alive, and that alone was a miracle. There was no music, no victory feast, no cinematic speeches. The first sound of victory was often a silence so eerie it made your ears ring. Then came the coughing, the crying, the groans of the dying, a discordant orchestra of people trying to figure out if they still had all their limbs. Soldiers stumbled through smoke, looking for their friends. Some found corpses, others found nothing, and in that fog of relief and confusion, something else began, scavenging, weapons, armor, anything of value, stripped from the dead like a second death. It wasn't dishonor, it was necessity. You needed gear, you needed coin, you needed food. Some men looted the enemy, others looted their own. Gold rings were pried from fingers, boots were pulled off corpses. Even teeth were sometimes yanked from mouths if they looked valuable. The battlefield after victory was a graveyard of desperation, and if you were lucky, enough to have held the field, you probably hadn't eaten in a day, maybe 2. Your stomach turned from adrenaline. Your hands shook. So what did victory look like? Sitting down, pouring water over a cut, finding a patch of grass that wasn't soaked in blood, and maybe, if your side had a bit of structure left, pouring ale down your throat until the memories blurred, because that was the only way some men could sleep. The winners didn't feel proud. They felt numb. They weren't counting medals. They were counting breaths. They looked around at the quiet, at the bodies, and they didn't say, "We won." They said, "We made it." And the difference between those two phrases is where the truth lives. That's the secret modern tales miss. In the real medieval battlefield, victory wasn't about banners or honor. It was about staying upright when the world fell sideways. It was about staggering away with a heartbeat. And sometimes, it was just about walking home with enough of your soul left intact to pretend you were still whole. That's what winning really looked like. The fighting stopped. The blades went quiet. But for the survivors of a medieval battle, the war didn't stay behind. It clung to them in their bones, in their blood, in their sleep. When the survivors trudged home, they carried more than scars. They carried everything they couldn't leave behind. And in many ways, what followed them was worse than anything they'd faced on the field. Let's start with the body. Wounds that didn't kill outright often maimed. An arrow in the thigh might leave you limping forever. A crushed hand meant you couldn't hold a plow or feed your children. Some men went blind from head injuries. Some lost speech from cracked jaws. And there was no disability insurance in the 13th century. No veteran's pension. You came back broken, and you were expected to work or beg. But it wasn't just the body that suffered. It was the mind. The term PTSD didn't exist yet, but the condition absolutely did. They called it being shaken, disturbed, haunted. Some men became angry and volatile. Others turned inward, silent, unreachable. Some drank to forget. Others couldn't sleep without hearing screams. You'd find them in the corner of the tavern, staring at nothing, or waking up at night, gasping, fists clenched. The trauma didn't need a name to exist. It just needed memory, and memory didn't let go. Relationships fractured. Wives didn't recognize the men who returned. Children feared the father whose eyes never softened. Communities treated veterans with a strange mix of reverence and distance. They respected what he had done, but feared what he had become. And many returned to nothing at all. Their farms had failed. Their homes were gone. Their village had moved on. So what did they do? Some became mercenaries. Fighting was all they knew. Others joined roving bands of ex-soldiers, half warriors, half outlaws, men who couldn't rejoin the world they had fought to protect. Some wandered, begging. Others hid. A few wrote. We have records, letters, poems, journal entries, of men who tried to make sense of what they'd seen. One wrote, "The field is quiet, but I still hear the horses." Another, "I killed a man who looked like my brother. Then I ate with my hands, because mine were too bloody to hold a spoon." These weren't weak men. They were simply human, stripped raw by the most inhuman thing imaginable. And still they walked. Still they lived. Still they tried. Because even if the war didn't end, they refused to let it define everything they were. And that, not the swordplay, not the armor, not the tactics, that is the most courageous part of any medieval battle. The long, quiet, endless aftermath. Strip away the myths, the banners, the armor polished for show, and what are you left with? Not noble warriors, not chivalrous duels, but terrified men, bleeding and stumbling through mud, trying to survive something no human was ever built. To endure, that's the truth no one wants to tell. Medieval battles weren't about honor. They were about desperation. They weren't waged with clean lines and noble intentions. They were waged with blunt weapons, filthy hands, shattered minds, and a hope sometimes no more than a whisper that maybe you'd live to see the next dawn. And yet, even in that horror, there was something undeniably human. These weren't just wars for kings and crowns. They were battles fought by farmers, blacksmiths, thieves, and boys barely old enough to hold a blade. They fought because they were told to, because they had no choice, because their homes were at stake, because they wanted to be remembered, because they didn't know what else to do. And in every blow, in every scream, in every fall, there was a message. I am here, I matter. This moment is mine. That's what we forget when we romanticize war. We turn it into story, into legend, into something clean. But real battle, it was chaos, confusion, 100 decisions made in a heartbeat, with no time to think, only react. The bravery wasn't in the charge. It was in staying 1 second longer than your fear said you could. The victory wasn't in taking ground. It was in standing your ground, even when your legs wanted to run. And the meaning, it wasn't always in the outcome. Sometimes it was in the act, in the climb, in the scream, in the refusal to die quiet. These men weren't heroes the way we imagine. They were flawed, frightened, feral, but they were real. And that realness, that pain, that courage, that complexity, that's what makes their stories matter. Because if we only remember the polished versions, we forget the cost. We forget the blood behind the banners, the wounds behind the victories, the silence behind the songs. So what actually happened in a medieval battle? Life happened. Death happened. Humanity happened at its loudest, its ugliest, its most unforgettable. What actually happened in a medieval battle wasn't about glory, it was about survival. The real war wasn't just for land or kings, it was for your next breath, your sanity, your soul. And the men who fought it weren't legends. They were us, broken, brave, human.